the whole story, but if I run short on time, feel free to shoot me away. Dad would have to get the job done before it started to rain. The forecast that morning over the radio said that there would be a thunderstorm warning from 11 till 6. And I remember my older brother Melvin telling me the difference between a warning and a watch. A watch means they aren't sure if the storm will actually hit, he said. A warning means they're sure. And so we went out there, me and Melvin following Dad out to the utility shed where he kept the tractor. It was more of a large shelter than a shed, a big metal archway that was filled in with a cement floor to keep it sturdy. Dad was proud of that shed. Had all of us help build it a couple summers before Mom got sick and had to stay in bed. I was only 10, but he was sure that I could contribute something. Your age don't matter, he said. Don't matter if you're a boy or a man. You do the work when it's got to be done. And with that, he handed me a rusted wrench that felt like the heaviest thing in the world. Dad had hard, serious eyes and a square jaw. They were features that never let their guard down, never softened. Melvin was 3 years older than me, and he looked more like Dad than I ever would, the same hard jaw. My face was more round and soft like Mom's, and before she got sick, we had the same eyes, brown with little flecks of gold. Me and Melvin both had our rain slickers on, because it was already looking pretty gray, the way clouds always come together right before a storm. I wasn't sure what he needed us for. He was the only one who knew how to drive the tractor. I guess he just wanted us to be there because this would be the first time we would see a cow get killed. He hadn't told us any details of what we would be doing, just said that the sooner we got it done, the better. Shirley. She was the only cow we'd had in years, and the only one I remember. Melvin told me that when I was really little, we had a lot more cows, nearly a dozen or so that we kept in the back of the barn. Shirley was the only one left now, and she was old and tired. She no longer produced milk, and Dad thought it was a waste of money to keep her alive and fed. I stopped and looked up at the second-story window, and I could barely make out Mom's face, her limp brown curls hanging at her cheeks and neck. Her bed was pushed up against the window. Dad had moved it so she could look outside whenever she wanted. He wanted her to be comfortable. The lights in her room were out, but I thought I saw her open her eyes, waking up a little before turning onto her other side. Her eyes had dimmed from the brown they used to be. At one point, Dad had made mention of the word cancer, and when I asked him what that meant, he told me that her insides had stopped working the way they should, that there wasn't much else the doctors could do. Said that she was in a lot of pain, and his hands twisted together as he said this, as though they were searching for more of an explanation, a different outcome that wasn't possible. After that, he'd said nothing else about it, just expected that we understood, and that we would be there to help him manage things. I stood there for a moment and stared at our house with its white wooden panels and gray shutters that were starting to look weather-beaten. We had these trees planted in the back of the house that sprouted small white blossoms in the spring. They were beautiful, but they had the worst smell, like dead fish. The way the metal door creaked loudly against the cement when Dad opened it made me shudder so much that Melvin gave me a strange look. "You all right?" he asked, and I nodded. Dad motioned with his arm for us to come in, and we helped him pull the tractor out onto the grass. It was small, but it was much heavier than I expected it to be. It wasn't even that high off the ground, and I knew that it didn't go very fast. But once Dad plopped himself down onto the seat, it looked like the powerful piece of equipment he'd always bragged about. Dad told us that when he was young, about my age, Grandpa taught him how to shoot, taught him that it was the most efficient and humane way to kill something. Dad wasn't a big fan of sharing his feelings, but he did tell us that he never got comfortable shooting a gun, never learned to react to the backfire properly, never quite got the aim down the way his father wanted him to. There was just something about holding a gun in his hands that made him nervous. And so when he married Mom and built his own house and barn, he decided it was time he did things his own way. Grandpa died when I was a baby, maybe 2 or so. Melvin told me he was one of those scary old men with a harshness in their eyes that you could tell had been there for a long time. He was kind of like Dad, but he spoke less, Melvin said, something I found hard to imagine. "You boys go in there and grab the big chain in the back and meet me by the barn," Dad said, yelling over the grumble of the tractor as he started it up. the stink of gasoline filling the air behind him. He drove away, heading toward the barn where Shirley slept by herself. I held the door open to let some light in while Melvin stumbled around trying to find the chain. He heaved part of it onto his shoulders, and I lifted the rest of it, both of us being careful not to trip over it as we walked to the barn. The tractor was parked in front, and Dad emerged from the darkness of the barn as Shirley at his side. Her head was hanging low, as though she was too tired to bother lifting it unless she had to. Her skin was a deep tan, and you could see some of her ribs pressing through it, like maybe she had lost a fair amount of weight. Dad hopped back onto the tractor and told us to take Shirley and follow him to the middle of the field, where he had us help him lock one end of the chain to the back of the tractor and wrap the other end around Shirley's neck. He just told us to stand there and wait. The first attempt failed. Shirley just started to follow behind him. Dad told me and Melvin to go around and grab onto her from behind. "She's stronger than I thought," he said, shouting over the engine. We each got behind one of her legs and grabbed on hard. One of my hands was gripping her thigh, while my other arm was wrapped around the top of her hip. This was the way Melvin had instructed me to do it, so that our hands wouldn't slide off. I could feel her muscles quivering from being pulled the first time. "All right, boys," Dad said. "I'll count to 3, and then you both pull as hard as you can while I steer the tractor forward. Got it?" "Yeah, we got it," Melvin shouted back for us both. And then he looked me in the eyes and said, "Grab on tight." And there was this strange look of reassurance on his face, like he was silently acknowledging that neither of us wanted to do this, but we were going to get through it. And I was so afraid, but there wasn't time for fear. So Dad counted, and we planted our feet into the ground. The second Dad started to inch forward, she knelt down on her front legs, sticking her rear end in the air and throwing us off balance. She lowered her head close to the ground. Melvin told me to climb on top with him. She was putting up as much of a fight as she could muster, and all the while Dad kept yelling at us. "Pull, boys, come on, pull hard." There was a brief moment when I glanced up from where I was sitting and pulling, and I saw Dad working just as hard as we were. He was leaning forward on top of the wheel of the tractor, as though if he put enough of his own body weight into it, the job would get done more quickly. His face was straining into redness. His back was half soaked with sweat. Melvin was hunched over me, and I wrapped my arms around her neck while he grabbed onto the taut part of the chain. We pulled and pulled. We both started letting out small groans when the cold metal dug into our skin. All of my fingers burned. Shirley was grunting and wailing, making noises I had never heard her make before. Awful noises that sounded like machines grinding together. And then the rain started. It came down all at once, as if the sky had been holding it in and waiting for just the right time. The rain struck down on us in sheets of water that felt frozen. I could see Dad shout something at us, and I could feel Melvin behind me shouting something back, but I could barely hear them through the thunder that clapped its hands above us. And then I could just make out Dad yelling something about how we were getting close. "She's losing steam now," I think I heard him say, and I noticed that Shirley had stopped wailing. She was squeaking and losing air, and her eyes were wide like 2 black pools. The chain had choked around her neck so tight that her head looked like a balloon that you would buy at the state fair, with a hard metal bow tied around the end to keep it from floating away. She rocked her body back and forth, trying to shake us off her, but her muscles were too weak. Melvin yelled into my ear, "Come on, Jim. We'll pull our hardest on 3. 1, 2, 3. I could feel my teeth grinding together as Shirley's neck finally snapped. Her broken bones felt like splintered wood. Her skin was still warm, but the muscle was limp and heavy. There was barely any blood, little imprints of it the chain had made from rubbing raw against her skin. Her eyes were wide open. Melvin squeezed my shoulder, trying to get me to let go. Just let go. After it was over, Dad told us to go inside and get cleaned up for dinner. "Don't you need help lifting her?" Melvin asked, and Dad just shook his head. Somehow he thought he could lift her all by himself. As me and Melvin walked through the kitchen door, I saw him hitching the small wooden trailer to the back of the tractor. I remember crawling into that thing whenever we played hide and seek. It was my best hiding place. Now Dad was covering Shirley with a bright blue tarp and hauling her body into it, yanking her head in first and then slowly the rest. He drove off, and to this day, I'm not entirely sure what he did with her. I let the door swing shut behind me, and I hurried upstairs to change into some dry clothes. Dad went about preparing a meal differently than Mom did. Ever since we'd gotten a blender for Christmas years earlier, Dad was so impressed by what it could do that he didn't think there were many other appliances worth using. Mom had taught him how to make mashed potatoes on the stove, and he decided to modify her technique, boiling the potatoes whole in the pot before tossing them into the magic blender to be chopped and blended more efficiently than if he were to mash them by hand. They always came out lumpy. I walked into the kitchen just in time to see him pressing the puree button. Melvin was circling the kitchen table, setting plates and silverware down in the appropriate places. I kept seeing Shirley everywhere, or parts of her. When Dad opened the fridge to grab the butter, I saw one of her front legs that had once looked massive and powerful, but were now shriveled and small. I saw her head staring at me in the sink, her black eyes blinking furiously. I pulled my chair out, but she was already sitting in it, or her lower half was, from the waist down, her legs shifting on the sides of the small seat, her tail slapping the air to get rid of the swarm of flies buzzing above her. "Jim," I heard my brother say. "You all right?" "Yeah, I'm okay," I said. I rubbed my eyes with my fists. "You look pale," Dad said, "like a ghost or something." "I'm fine," I said, lying and swallowing my breath before sitting down. We ate mostly in silence, except when one of us needed the butter or the salt to be passed, or when Dad said, "Give me another roll." I usually had a healthy appetite, but I kept pushing my food around my plate with my fork, and when I did have a bite, it tasted too salty, like blood in my mouth. I only managed to choke down half of my meal with 2 glasses of water. As Melvin started to clear away the table, Dad pushed a full plate of food in front of me, and I looked up at him confused. "It's not for you," he said. "Take this plate up to your mother." I walked up the creaking wood stairs to her bedroom, a plate loaded full with a fried chicken leg, a buttered roll, half an ear of corn, and a pile of Dad's lumpy mashed potatoes. Food that she would no doubt leave mostly uneaten. I had a glass of water for her, too, that was filled to the brim, and so it was spilling out onto my shirt and the steps as I went. There was a small stream of light poking out from under her door, but other than that, the second floor was dark. There was music coming from her room. I used the back of my water glass hand to lightly tap the door, and I didn't hear her, so I thought she must have dozed off. The music became louder when I walked in, from a record turning on the record player, and Mom was lying down facing the window. I recognized the song. It was called Bolero, one of Mom's favorite pieces because she said it was often playing in her dreams. There was something haunting about that song. The more I heard it, the more it made me feel strange, like it was melting through me. Before she met Dad, Mom was going to school to be a classical musician, a cellist. But once I met your father, that all changed, she had told me once when she was still well. She met him one night when she was out at a diner with some of her friends from college. Dad was working there as a busboy. She was serious about music, but she fell in love with him, and by the end of her sophomore year, she dropped out. She wanted to start a family. She kept a cello downstairs, but I had never seen her play it. I guess she just didn't have the time. It was still pouring rain outside. I set the plate down on the dresser next to her bed, and I started to quietly back away toward the door. But she turned over and grabbed me by the wrist harder than I thought she had the strength to. My heart felt like it had stopped for a second. I hadn't thought she was awake. "Sorry," I choked out. "Dad wanted me to bring you something to eat." Mom's ever-dimming brown eyes glanced over at the plate and then straight back at me. She loosened her grip on my wrist and kissed my hand before holding it in both of hers. Her skin felt dry and a little chapped. "Thank you," she said. "You can just leave it here. I'll eat it a little later." She let go of my hand and turned back over to the window. "I know what you were doing out there today," she said, almost accusing me. I couldn't respond. I forced myself to stare out the window into darkness, at the rain hitting the glass. "Are you all right?" she asked. I wanted to just pour it all out to her, how scared I had been through the whole thing, how I could barely eat, I was so shaken by it all. But I hesitated, worried about what saying all of those things would lead to. "I'm not sure," I said. "You don't look all right. You know you can talk to me." She looked back at me and smiled, though it was clear she was exhausted, taking in long breaths that were nearly drowned out by the music. I know, I'm just tired, I guess. Well, maybe that's what you need right now, to just lie down and sleep. Mom pulled me down and into her chest. She wrapped her arms around me, and they felt a little cold against my back. I won't go anywhere, she whispered. You get some rest. I'll do the same. And when she let go of me, it was clear that she was already starting to drift off, rolling back over to face the window. I stood there for a few moments, watching the lightning illuminate the field where we had killed her. I saw Shirley lying in the field, her tan body curled up like Mom in her bed, her back facing me, as though she could be dead or alive, but either way, she had started out sleeping. When lightning struck again, she was gone. Late that night, I felt Dad walking into the bedroom that Melvin and me shared. Melvin was down the hall in the bathroom, washing up and brushing his teeth, and Dad came in and sat on the edge of my bed in the dark. I think he could tell that I was awake, and so he spoke up. He told me that I could rest the next day, and that he wouldn't hold it against me. Just don't bother your mother, he said, his voice raspy. I could feel myself holding in my breath as he spoke, and then he got up and left the door open a little ways behind him, leaking enough light into the room for me to squint my eyes before Melvin came back down the hall and flipped off each switch. I heard Melvin hesitate as he climbed into his own bed beside mine, like he wanted to say something. But he didn't know I was awake, so he just sprawled out. All I could see was the moon cut in half and hanging outside our window. I started to cry, unable to stop it from coming, and I cupped a hand over my mouth so that Melvin wouldn't hear me. Thank you.